Hey, welcome back, my friend. If you are new here, genuinely, truly, warmly welcome. And if you have been here before, I am so glad you came back tonight. Get comfortable. Dim the lights a little if you can. Maybe grab a blanket. Because what I have for you tonight is one of those stories that starts quiet and then just stays with you. Imagine you're a girl, 14 years old, maybe 15. You wake up one morning in the year 1300 and something. The fire in the hearth is still breathing softly. The village outside is just beginning to stir, and someone tells you that you're getting married. Not, we found a wonderful person for you. Not, there is someone we would like you to meet. Just, it has been decided. And here is the thing that will genuinely surprise you. The most shocking part of this story is not what you might think. It is not the ceremony. It is not the age. It is not even the man she was given to. It is the paperwork. Because in medieval Europe, before anyone exchanged a single vow, before a priest said a single prayer, before a single flower was braided into a single bride's hair, there were negotiations. There were numbers on a table. There was, in the most literal sense of the word, a price. And tonight, we're going to find out exactly what that price looked like, what it meant for the woman at the center of it all. And I promise you, some of what you are going to hear will genuinely change the way you think about marriage, money, and power in the world we call the Middle Ages. Before we go any further, I just want to say, if something I bring you tonight makes you think, makes you feel, makes you want to share it with someone that means the world to me truly, if you feel like this channel is worth your time, a like or a subscribe does more for this little storytelling corner of the internet than you probably realize. And I would absolutely love to know where you're watching from tonight, or what time it is wherever you are in the world. Drop it in the comments, I read every single one. Alright. Soft lights, maybe a gentle fan humming in the background. Let us begin. Let us go back to England. Somewhere in the countryside. Somewhere between the year 1200 and the year 1350, that golden, muddy, complicated stretch of time historians call the High Middle Ages. A girl's father is sitting across a table from another man. They are not friends exactly. They are two families who have decided that their futures might be better stitched together than kept apart. And they are talking about money. Now here is the first thing I want you to understand, because movies and fairy tales have told us exactly the wrong story about this. We tend to picture the medieval bride as passive, as property, as a human gift handed from one family to another with a bow on top. And yes, in some ways that is painfully true. But the financial structure around medieval marriage was actually far more complicated, more layered, and in some cases more protective of women than we give it credit for. Here is how it actually worked. There were three things happening at the same time, three financial rivers flowing into the same ceremony. The first was the dowry. The bride's family, her father or her guardian if her father had died, would provide a sum of money, goods, land, or some combination of all three to go with the daughter into her new marriage. Now, the modern instinct is to read this as the family paying someone to take their daughter, and honestly, in some cold-blooded negotiations, that is not entirely unfair. But the deeper truth is that the dowry was at its core a daughter's inheritance given early. In medieval law, when a daughter married and received her dowry, she was in theory receiving her share of the family estate, the portion that would otherwise only come to her when her parents died. It was prepaid inheritance. For a peasant family, a dowry might be a small chest of household goods, a few linen cloths, a copper pot, perhaps a goat. For a merchant family, it might be 100 silver marks and a bolt of fine cloth. For a noble family, well. When Mary, the daughter of Henry VII, was married in 1514, her dowry was 300,000 crowns. That is roughly £60,000 in the money of her day, a sum so large it shaped diplomatic relations between two kingdoms. But most women were not princesses. Most women were closer to the girl in that quiet farmhouse whose entire dowry might have been worth less than a lord's horse. The second financial river was the dower, and this one is important, so I want you to hold it carefully. The dower was not what the bride brought to the marriage. The dower was what the groom promised to give her if he died first. Under English common law, a widow was entitled to 1/3 of all the lands and property her husband held at the time of their marriage. Not borrowed, not lent, hers. She would hold that land for the rest of her life, meaning she would collect the rents, produce the income from it. She could not sell it because it ultimately passed to the children, but she could live off it, independently. Think about what that actually means for a moment. In a world with no pension, no savings account, no social safety net. The dower was essentially a woman's retirement plan written into the contract of her own wedding. Historians who have combed through the manorial records of medieval England have found widows who outlived their husbands by decades managing their dower lands with remarkable skill, appearing in court documents as independent legal actors. A widow in medieval England had more legal standing, more property rights, and more financial agency than a married woman, which is one of those dark little ironies that medieval history is absolutely full of. You gained freedom when your husband died. Marriage itself was, legally speaking, a kind of disappearing act for a woman. And then there was the third thing, the one that tends to make modern jaws drop a little. If you were a peasant woman, specifically if you were a serf, what the medieval world called a villain, you could not simply decide to get married. You had to ask permission from your lord, and you had to pay for it. This payment was called the merchet, and it shows up in manorial court rolls, those incredible dusty legal records that historians have been painstakingly reading for generations all across medieval England. The reasoning was breathtakingly unsentimental. When a serf woman married and went to live on her husband's land, her lord lost a worker. Her labour, her potential children's labour, all of that productive value was walking out the gate. So he charged for it. The amount varied. Sometimes it was a few pence. Sometimes it was a cow. Sometimes it was a sum equivalent to weeks of wages. And if a serf woman had premarital sex without permission, there was a separate fine for that too, called the legawite, which roughly translates as charmingly, the lying down fine. There was, for what it is worth, no corresponding fine for men. Just so we are all clear on how that worked. Now I want to zoom out for a moment and sit with the full picture of what we have. A woman on her wedding day in medieval Europe was standing at the centre of a transaction that had been negotiated, argued over and documented sometimes years before the wedding actually happened. Her dowry had been assembled perhaps by a father who was ill and worried about her future, perhaps by a mother who had been quietly setting aside linen since the girl was 6 years old. Her dower rights had been written into a legal agreement that would only matter if her husband died before she did. And if she was a serf, her lord had signed off on the whole arrangement in exchange for a payment that acknowledged in the plainest possible language that she had always been in some sense property. And yet, here is what I find genuinely moving about all of this, and I think about it a lot. All of that paperwork, all of those negotiations, all of those cold financial calculations, they were also in their own tangled way a form of care. A father sitting across that table was not just making a business deal. He was in most cases trying to ensure his daughter would not starve. He was trying to make sure that if the worst happened, if her husband died, if the crops failed, if war swept through the valley, she would have something. Imperfect, yes. Unfair, absolutely. But not nothing. The medieval marriage contract was a cage, but it was a cage built at least in part by people who were terrified of what would happen to the women they loved if they left them with nothing at all. And I want to leave you with one more detail before we move forward. Historians studying marriage contracts from the Catalan town of Vic in northeastern Spain, looking at over 1,500 notarial contracts written between 1250 and 1350, found something that completely upended what they expected to find. In roughly 80 of those contracts, it was not the bride's family who brought the dowry. It was the groom, men who wanted to marry into a prominent family with a daughter who would inherit men who wanted to join that family's wealth, rather than draw her away from it, occasionally brought dowries themselves. In one case from the year 1293, a man named Jaume de Montcabrère paid 1,000 sous to marry a woman named Maria. She gave him back a counter-gift worth only half that. In another, and this one, I genuinely love, a man named Père de Belstar paid 8,000 sous to marry a woman named Sansa, daughter of Jaume de Saint-Hippolyte. In return, Sansa brought a castle. I repeat, she brought a castle. Even in a world where women were rarely asked what they thought, even in a world where the financial machinery of marriage was built almost entirely to benefit men, there were women whose value was simply too great to ignore, whose inheritance was too significant to hand away without demanding something extraordinary in return. History, as always, is more complicated than the story we were told, and that is what tonight is about, not the fairy tale version of the medieval bride, passive, beautiful, silent, but the real version, the one with a dowry list and a dower agreement, the one whose father haggled over the terms, the one who stepped across the threshold of a new life carrying the weight of every negotiation that had ever been held in her name. We're just getting started, because we have not even talked about how old she actually was when all of this happened, and I promise you the answer's going to surprise you. So we left her standing at the edge of a financial negotiation she had no say in. The paperwork was done, the dowry was agreed, the dower rights had been written into a contract somewhere in a cold stone room, and now everyone, her father, her lord the church, the groom's family, was ready to move forward. There was just one remaining question, one that historians have argued about for generations, one that movies and textbooks have almost universally gotten wrong. How old was she? Here is what most people believe about medieval brides. She was young, probably very young, 12, 13, maybe even younger in some darkened corner of history where nobody was watching. And honestly, that image has been burned into our cultural imagination so deeply that even people who consider themselves fairly well read about the Middle Ages carry it around like a fact. But let me ask you something. Honestly, have you ever actually looked at what the records say? Because I did. And what I found was one of those moments where history quietly taps you on the shoulder and says you had this almost entirely backwards. Let us start with the actual numbers. In the 14th and 15th centuries in Yorkshire and Yorkshire, Blessett has some of the most detailed surviving records of common people in medieval England. The age range for most brides was between 18 and 22 years old. Not 12, not 14, 18 to 22. And for women living in towns and cities, the age was often even higher, into the mid-20s. Now the poll tax records from 1377, which historians have spent decades poring over, painted a picture of medieval England where roughly 60% of adult women were married. Not 90%. Not. Everyone married young and stayed married forever. 60%. Which means a substantial number of women in medieval England were at any given moment unmarried. Working, saving, waiting for the right circumstances. The peasant woman who married young was not the typical case. She was the exception, shaped by desperation or pressure. The woman who worked for years as a farm hand, a domestic servant, a dairymaid who saved her own small wage, assembled her own modest dowry, and married somewhere around her 20th birthday. That was actually closer to normal. Now here is where it gets complicated. Because here is the thing that is also true at the same time: canon law, the law of the church, which governed marriage across all of Europe, set the legal minimum age of marriage at 12 for girls and 14 for boys, and there were absolutely cases of girls that young being married. Among the nobility, among the very wealthy, among the families whose entire strategy for survival involved stitching bloodlines together through betrothal contracts and land arrangements, yes, young marriages happened, and they have dominated our picture of medieval marriage ever since, precisely because those are the families whose records survived. Kings and earls and barons wrote things down. Their children's marriages were documented. The farmer's daughter in Lincolnshire mostly was not. So we have built our entire mental image of the medieval bride on the experiences of the tiniest, most politically extraordinary sliver of the population. That is like trying to understand what modern American marriage looks like by only studying the weddings of the Kardashians. But I want to be careful here, because the young marriages that did happen, especially among the nobility, were genuinely serious, genuinely consequential, and not something history should soften. There is one story in particular that I keep coming back to because it captures everything, the cruelty, the calculation, the human cost, in a way that no amount of abstract statistics ever could. Her name was Margaret Beaufort. She was born in 1443 in Bedfordshire, England. Her father, the Duke of Somerset, died when she was barely a year old, leaving her one of the most valuable heiresses in the kingdom. That word valuable is doing a lot of work in this story. By the time she was 6 years old, she had already been placed in a betrothal contract. Not because anyone particularly cared about Margaret, but because controlling her inheritance meant controlling a significant piece of England's future. She was 10 years old when King Henry VI decided to dissolve that first arrangement and reassign her wardship, which is to say her entire person and estate, to his half-brothers Edmund and Jasper Tudor. By November of 1455, Margaret Beaufort was 12 years old. She was small for her age, slender, reportedly quite religious, already deeply devout, and she was married to Edmund Tudor, who was 24 years old. Now, and I need you to hold this detail carefully, the church actually encouraged couples with young brides to wait until the girl was at least 14 or 15 before consummating the marriage. This was not an obscure footnote in canon law. It was widely understood, widely practiced, at least in theory. Edmund Tudor did not wait. Within months of the wedding, Margaret was pregnant. She was 12 years old and carrying a child in a body that had not finished growing. Edmund was captured at Carmarthen Castle, contracted plague, and died on November the 1st, 1456, his own wedding anniversary. Margaret was 13 years old, 7 months pregnant, and a widow. She travelled in winter, which I think about every time I complain about cold weather, across difficult roads to Pembroke Castle in Wales, where she placed herself under the protection of her brother-in-law Jasper Tudor, and there on January the 28th, 1457, she gave birth to the child who would one day become King Henry VII. Both mother and child survived, but the birth, according to every historical account that followed, had permanently damaged her body. Despite marrying twice more after Edmund's death, Margaret Beaufort never had another child. And here is the line that stopped me cold when I first read it. Decades later, when her own granddaughter was being considered for marriage to the King of Scotland, Margaret personally lobbied against the match until the girl was at least 14. Her exact words, as recorded at the time, she feared the king would not wait, and would injure her and endanger her health. She knew, from her own body, from her own 13-year-old winter. She carried that knowledge for the rest of her long and extraordinary life, and spent the last decades of it making sure other girls would not have to carry it too. And here is what I find so significant about Margaret Beaufort's story, not just as a tragedy but as a historical corrective. Historian Dan Jones, writing about this period, put it plainly, Even by medieval standards, Margaret Beaufort is obscenely young to be pregnant. Even by medieval standards, medieval people were not indifferent to the dangers of early pregnancy. They were not cavalier about young girls and childbirth. Medical texts of the period, and there were several written specifically about women's health, uniformly agreed on one thing: a pregnant woman should be a woman, not a girl. The specific age varied from text to text, but the principle was consistent. When John Lovell got his 13-year-old wife Joan pregnant in the same period, both fathers, the girl's father and the boy's father, reacted with outrage. One of them actually wrote in his will that the union existed, and I love this phrase, to the fury of God. These were not modern people with modern values quietly inserted into a medieval context. These were people of their time operating within their own world, and they still looked at what happened to a young girl's body through early pregnancy and called it what it was: wrong. So let me paint you the real picture. The medieval bride, the most common, most historically typical medieval bride, was not a child. She was a young woman somewhere between 18 and 22 years old, who'd probably spent several years working, saving, watching, building a small understanding of the world before she stepped into its most binding contract. She may have helped her mother run a household. She may have worked as a servant in someone else's house, which was actually extremely common. Historians studying the poll tax records found that roughly 20% of households in the county of Rutland alone employed live-in servants in 1377. Many of those servants were young women, working, learning, waiting. She was not passive. She was not a decoration. She was someone accumulating knowledge and resources, however slowly, however imperfectly, in the only ways the world of her time allowed. And then one day the negotiation concluded. The banns were read at the church door 3 Sundays in a row, a public announcement giving anyone who knew of a reason the marriage should not happen a chance to speak up. Did she want this marriage? Sometimes, genuinely yes. The records of ecclesiastical court cases from this period, the equivalent of today's civil disputes over marital validity, are full of voices. Women who fought to have their marriages recognized. Women who fought to have them dissolved. Women who said clearly and on the record that they had given their consent freely. Women who said equally clearly that they had not. The Church had actually established in the 12th century that the free consent of both parties was the only thing truly required for a valid marriage. Not the priest, not the witnesses, not the banns, just 2 people saying yes, which sounds beautiful until you remember that social pressure, financial need, family obligation, and the entire weight of a patriarchal world were all pressing down on the word yes from the moment a girl first understood what marriage meant. I think about that sometimes. What it meant to say yes in a world like that. Not yes in the modern sense, the yes of someone who has options, who has considered and compared and imagined alternatives, but yes in the medieval sense. The yes of someone who understood that this was how the story went, who may have felt nothing romantic about the man across from her, or may have felt everything, who was stepping forward into a life that would demand things from her body, her time, her labour and her identity in ways she could barely imagine on the morning of her wedding. Who said yes anyway, because that was what you did, and sometimes not always, but sometimes because some part of her quietly hoped it would be all right. And here is the thing I want you to sit with before we move forward. We have spent a lot of time in this story talking about paperwork and politics and age. All of it real, all of it documented, all of it important. But we have not yet talked about the wedding itself, the actual moment, the ceremony and what it looked like. And I promise you it looked almost nothing like what you are picturing right now. Because here is the part that genuinely delighted me when I discovered it. In medieval England, you did not actually have to get married in a church. You could get married in a pub, on a road. at a friend's kitchen table, even according to at least one historian's careful reading of the records in bed, and it would be completely legally spiritually valid. That story is coming up next. Right, so we have talked about the price she carried into this marriage. We have talked about her age and why the answer was almost certainly not what you expected. Now it is time for the day itself, the wedding. And I want to start with something that I genuinely could not stop thinking about after I first came across it in the historical records. Something that, if you were to tell most people today, they would assume you had made up. In medieval England, you did not need a church to get married. You did not need a priest. You did not need witnesses. You did not need a ceremony of any kind. All you needed, all the church required from the 12th century onward, were 2 words. I do. Or more precisely, the equivalent in your own language, I take you as my wife. I take you as my husband. That was it. That was a legally valid, spiritually binding, church-recognized marriage. One historian's careful reading of the legal records found that people married on roads, in inns, at a friend's kitchen table, in a forest, and yes, in at least some documented cases in bed. Not metaphorically, in an actual bed. Where presumably both parties were already comfortable, and someone decided that was as good a moment as any to make things official. I am not making this up. The records say what the records say. Now, before you start imagining medieval England as some kind of romantic free-for-all where love happened wherever love happened, and the church just nodded along, let me add the complication. Because there is always a complication. The church recognized these informal clandestine marriages as valid. But it absolutely did not like them, and for good reason actually. When there were no witnesses, no documents, no public announcement, disputes got ugly very fast. A woman who believed she was married suddenly found her husband claiming no such thing had ever happened. A man who had exchanged vows in a moment of passion found himself legally bound to someone he barely knew. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, one of the most consequential gatherings in medieval church history, explicitly forbade clandestine marriages and required the public reading of bans, 3 separate announcements in the parish church on 3 consecutive Sundays, giving the entire community a chance to raise any objection. Is this person already married? Are these two too closely related? Did one of them take religious vows they have not properly dissolved? If anyone knew of a reason the marriage should not happen, this was their moment. And the rule about the bans, by the way, is still practiced today in many churches. That moment in a ceremony when the officiant asks if anyone has any objections, that is a direct descendant of the medieval ban. The church created it to stop the chaos of people marrying each other in beds and forests without bothering to tell anyone first. Human nature, as always, required a lot of structure to manage. So, what did a proper medieval wedding actually look like? Picture a morning in early summer, because weddings were generally held in the morning before noon, following a tradition tied to attending Mass while still in a state of fasting. The bride's household has been preparing for days, not months, not years, not in the way we prepare today. There is no wedding planner, no venue deposit, no guest list spreadsheet, but there is food being organised, neighbours being consulted, the best dress being carefully aired and inspected. And about that dress, this is one of my favourite moments to tell people, because the reaction is so reliably delightful. The bride was almost certainly not wearing white. In medieval England, white was the colour of mourning. You wore it to funerals, you associated it with grief. Putting a bride in white would have been to a medieval eye roughly equivalent to throwing a birthday party and decorating it with tombstones. The most popular colour for a medieval bride was blue because blue symbolised purity. And this, historians believe, is the origin of the old tradition of wearing something blue at a wedding. It is not a charm or a superstition. It is a memory of a time when the whole dress was blue. For noble women with resources, the gown might be deep red or rich gold made from velvet silk or satin, sometimes so expensive that a single dress cost more than a peasant family earned in a year. For everyone else, it was simply their best dress, whatever that happened to be. And both the bride and groom would walk to the church together, accompanied by family, friends, neighbours, musicians. A small procession through the village or along the road, because a wedding was not a private event. It was a community event. Everyone who mattered to both families was expected to witness it. The ceremony itself happened at the church door, not inside, outside. This surprises people. We picture the medieval world as deeply organically religious, and it was but the actual exchange of vows happened on the steps in the open air, in front of everyone who had gathered. The logic was practical and brilliant at the same time. This was the most public place in any village. By standing here in full view, the couple made their promises in front of the entire community. There could be no future claim of that never happened. Everyone saw it. The rain saw it. The mud saw it. Which is probably why so many medieval English churches were built with unusually large porches. The architect was not being extravagant. He was building a room for marriages. At the church door, the groom would give the bride a gift, typically a ring, though sometimes a brooch, sometimes a coin. This object was called the wed, and this is, by the way, where the word wedding actually comes from. Not from anything romantic, not from the Latin for union or the French for promise, from wed. The gift, the pledge, the object that sealed the deal. The ring, when given, was placed on the right hand of the bride, not the left. Only later in the 14th century did a priest declare that a vein ran directly from the left fourth finger to the heart, and from that point the ring moved hands. I find it charming and slightly ridiculous in equal measure that the most intimate symbol of romantic commitment in Western culture changed hands based on the anatomical theory of a 14th century clergyman, who it turns out was completely wrong about how veins work, after the vows were exchanged, after the wed was given and accepted, after the priest had confirmed that both parties consented freely, and that no one in the assembled crowd had stepped forward to object. The doors of the church opened, and everyone went inside for the nuptial mass. This was the spiritual heart of the occasion, the blessing that transformed a civil contract into a sacrament. The bride and groom knelt at the altar while attendants held a canopy over their heads. The priest said Mass. Prayers were offered for fertility, for health, for long life. The choir, if there was one, sang. And then it was over. The formal part, at least. The part that changed everything legally and spiritually. The whole ceremony, from the procession to the church to the final blessing inside, probably took less time than the average modern wedding rehearsal dinner. And then came the feast. Oh, the feast. If I could time travel to one moment in medieval history just to experience it firsthand honestly, I think I might choose a good wedding feast. Not for the food, though. The food was extraordinary. Roasted pheasant and mallard duck. Venison from the Lord's hunting grounds. Pork pies with their tops cut open and filled with spice sauces. Pottages, thick soups of meat and vegetables in quantities enough to feed half the county. Oysters steamed in milk, candied fruits, stacked pastries so tall that the couple was expected to lean across them and kiss without toppling the pile, because prosperity supposedly followed those who managed it. Not for the entertainment, though. There were minstrels who sang love songs and bards who told heroic tales and musicians who played until the guests were too tired to dance. But for what it meant. Because the wedding feast was not just a party, it was a declaration. It was the entire community gathering to say, we saw this, we witnessed it, we will remember it. If anyone disputes this marriage in a church court 10 years from now, 100 people in this room will stand up and say they were here. Feast for noble families could last 3 full days. For common families, it might be a single evening. But in either case, the community showed up. Because showing up was how the medieval world made things real. Now I want to pause here and ask you something. I have been thinking about the bride through all of this. The woman at the center of this entire elaborate ceremony. What do you imagine she was feeling? Relief, excitement, dread. A kind of quiet numbness that comes from stepping towards something so large you cannot quite process it while it is happening. The honest answer is that we rarely know. Women's voices from this period are precious and rare. Most people did not write things down. Most women wrote even less. The words that survive belong almost entirely to men, to priests writing about what marriage should be, to lawyers writing about what it was, to poets writing about what it felt like when it went wrong. But there are glimpses. Church court records, those legal depositions where people testified about disputed marriages, contained fragments of direct speech. A woman describing the moment she agreed to marry. The exact words used. The circumstances. Whether she felt she had a real choice. And what strikes me reading those records carefully is how human they are. Not tragic, not uniformly resigned. Human. There are women who testified that they gave their consent gladly. There are women who testified that they gave their consent under pressure they could not resist. There are women who said they had loved the man before the ceremony, and women who said they had barely met him. What they shared almost universally was a sense that this day was the day the trajectory of their entire life turned. Not in some abstract metaphorical sense, literally. Before the church door, one kind of existence, after it a completely different one. Here is the thing that stays with me about medieval wedding ceremonies. We've spent 500 years building distance between ourselves and the Middle Ages. We've told ourselves that they were different, more brutal, more primitive, more alien to our modern sensibilities. And in some ways, yes, they were. But a woman standing at a church door in the year 1340 trying to keep her dress clean in the mud, listening to the priest read the words that would bind her to a stranger, was not so different from a woman standing in a church today, heart-hammering flowers slightly wilted, wondering if she was making the right decision. The ceremony has changed. The dress has changed. The location has changed. But the feeling of standing at the edge of a new life and stepping over that, I suspect, has never changed at all. She stepped over. The vows were said. The wed was given and accepted. The feast lasted until the candles burned down, and now she was someone's wife, which meant that beginning the very next morning, and I mean this almost literally, her entire world changed. Because the woman who walked into that marriage did not just change her name or her address or her legal status. She walked into a job, a completely unglamorous, physically demanding, constantly underestimated, absolutely essential job that she had probably been training for her entire life, without anyone ever actually telling her what it involved. What did that job look like? What did she actually do from sunrise to sunset every single day of that first extraordinary, terrifying, overwhelming year? That is where we are going next. The morning after the feast, everything was different. The music had stopped. The guests had gone home, or in the case of a noble wedding, were still sleeping it off somewhere in the hall. The garlands were wilting, and she was waking up in a house that was not hers. Not yet. That word yet is doing a lot of work in this part of the story, because one of the things that nobody warned the new medieval bride about, one of the things that the financial negotiations and the banns and the ceremony and the 3-day feast had completely failed to address, was the social landscape she had just walked into. Not the marriage, the household. Those are two very different things, and the distinction was about to become extremely clear, Let me paint you the scene. She arrived whether by walking across the village or travelling by cart for several days into a place with its own rhythms, its own rules, its own chain of command. Servants who had worked there for years, a cook who had her own opinions about how things were done, a steward who reported technically to her now, except that he had been reporting to her husband's family for 20 years and had earned a great deal more trust than this new girl had, and presiding over all of it, quite possibly her mother-in-law. I want to pause here because I think this deserves a moment of genuine appreciation. The relationship between a new bride and her mother-in-law in medieval Europe is one of those things that historians can document thoroughly, and that human nature has understood across every culture for literally all of recorded time. In a medieval noble or merchant household, the mistress of the house, the woman who held the keys, who directed the servants, who knew where everything was stored, was frequently the mother of the groom, and those keys were not transferred automatically upon marriage. This was not a symbolic detail. The keys meant authority. The person who held the keys to the storerooms, the spice chests, the pantry, the wine cellar, that person controlled the household's resources. That person decided what was cooked, what was served, what was spent, what was saved. The word for this authority, the word that historians trace directly back to the medieval period, is châtelaine, from the French word for the mistress of the chateau. And the physical object that symbolized it was exactly that, a ring of keys worn at the waist announcing to everyone in the household exactly who was in charge. A new bride did not simply arrive and receive those keys. She had to earn them. She had to demonstrate competence. She had to prove, often over months, that she understood what the keys meant and could be trusted to hold them. And until that moment arrived, she was learning, in someone else's house, under someone else's eye. Now here is something I've thought about quite a bit. We tend to romanticize medieval women's domestic roles, or alternatively we dismiss them entirely as oppressive drudgery. Both of those readings miss what the historical record actually shows. Running a medieval household was not housework in the modern sense. It was not vacuuming and meal prep. It was logistics on a scale that most of us today would find overwhelming. And we have a remarkable document that brings this to life in a way no history textbook ever quite manages. In the year 1393, late 14th century Paris, a man known to historians as the Goodman of Paris sat down and wrote his young wife a book. She was 15 or 16 years old. He was somewhere in his 60s, a prosperous widower, and he had apparently discovered fairly quickly after the wedding that his new bride had no idea how to run his household. To his enormous credit, rather than simply being annoyed about this, he decided to write it all down for her. The resulting document is extraordinary. It covers everything from how to hire and fire servants to the best butchers and fishmongers in Paris, from the proper care of horses to 17 different methods for removing stains from cloth. He tells her how to plant vegetables by season, how to prepare spiced wine, how to rid a bedroom of fleas, which, if you are wondering, involved spreading elder leaves across the floor and hoping for the best. And he writes something in the introduction that I find quietly remarkable. He explains that he is writing the book not just for their marriage, but so that after he dies, when she is young and will presumably remarry, she will already know how to run any household she enters. That is the practical medieval mind in its purest form, not sentimental, not romantic, but genuinely in its own way kind. He was preparing a teenage girl for a world in which she would have to manage alone, and he did it by writing her a handbook. So what did a medieval wife actually do all day? Let us trace it from the beginning. She woke before dawn, not because she was especially virtuous, but because the household did not operate on her schedule. The household operated on a schedule that began before sunrise and did not stop until after dark. The first thing she would typically do was attend morning prayers, Religion structured the medieval day in a way that is genuinely difficult for a modern person to fully grasp. The canonical hours, the 6 daily prayer times that bells rang out across any town where a church or monastery was nearby, divided the day into segments as precise as any modern clock. The household rose for prime at dawn. Terce came mid-morning. Sext at noon. None in the mid-afternoon. Vespers at evening. Compline at nightfall. This was not optional. This was the rhythm of life itself. After prayers the work began. In a noble or merchant household, her mornings were consumed by supervision. Supervision is the right word, and I want to be precise about it. She was not washing the floors herself. She was not necessarily kneading the bread. Those tasks belonged to the servants, the maids, the scullions. But she was watching, directing, correcting, and deciding which servants were doing their work well and which were not, whether the kitchen had enough salt for the week, whether the grain stores were holding against the season, whether the linen needed mending or replacing, whether a servant who looked unwell should be rested or set to lighter work. These decisions mattered enormously, not in a philosophical sense, in a survival sense. A medieval household that ran out of preserved food in February in a world without refrigeration, without grocery stores, without any supply chain that could be called upon in an emergency faced genuine hardship. The person responsible for preventing that was the wife, and this is not a trivial point. Historians studying the household accounts of Eleanor of Leicester, the wife of Simon de Montfort, recorded in astonishing detail from the year 1265, found records of purchases, allocations, and distributions that reveal a woman managing the logistics of a travelling court with dozens of people depending on her for their daily sustenance. Not a passive presence. An active administrator. Let me ask you something. If someone put you in charge of a household with 20 or 30 people in it, responsible for feeding them clothing, them managing their work, negotiating with merchants, maintaining the stores, overseeing the sick, and keeping the whole enterprise solvent, how long do you think it would take you to learn the job a year more? Now imagine you arrived knowing almost nothing. Because in medieval England, a woman's preparation for this role was largely informal and observational. She had watched her mother do it. She may have helped. She may have worked in another household as a servant and absorbed some knowledge there. But there was no formal training, no qualification, no period where someone sat her down and said, "Here is everything you need to know before we hand you this responsibility." She learned by doing, and the doing started on her very first morning. There is a 15th century ballad that historians have quoted many times because it captures this world so perfectly. It is called The Tyrannical Husband, and in it a ploughman challenges his wife to swap work for a day. He will do hers, she will do his. The wife agrees, and then she begins to list what he will have to manage. Getting up before him while he's still in bed, starting the fire, feeding the animals, making the cheese, caring for the children, baking the bread, cleaning the house, managing the dairy, spinning the thread, preparing meals for the full household. The ballad was apparently never finished. The ending has been lost to time, but the husband's response partway through her list is recorded. "Teach me no more housewifery," he says. He quit before he even started. Now I want to say something clearly because this is one of those moments where the history has a point of view and I think it is worth naming. The medieval wife's work was labour. Real skilled, physically demanding, economically essential labour. In the 14th century, an analysis of coroner records for rural England, those remarkable legal documents that recorded accidental deaths in village communities, found that roughly 30% of women died in accidents inside their homes compared to 12% of men. Not because women were clumsier, because they were there more, working, constantly, at the fire, near the boiling pots, in the storage rooms, at the spinning wheel. The medieval household was not a refuge from the working world. For the woman who ran it, the household was the working world. And unlike a man whose labour was often seasonal or task-specific, her labour had no off-season, no period where someone said, "Rest, you have done enough." The household needed to eat tomorrow, so the work continued. But here is where I want to push back slightly against the image of pure exhaustion. Because there was also something else in that work, something the historical record does not always show clearly, but that I think was absolutely present: authority. When a medieval wife stood in her own kitchen directing a cook twice her age when she walked into the storeroom and assessed what was needed before winter, when she organised the textile production that clothed the entire household, she was exercising a kind of power that had no legal name but was absolutely real in daily life. The goodman of Paris understood this. The woman who held the keys understood this. The household understood it too. There is a pattern historians have observed repeatedly in medieval records when a husband was absent, gone to war, gone on pilgrimage, gone to court on legal matters. The wife did not simply wait for him to return. She ran everything. She negotiated with tenants. She managed disputes. She corresponded with merchants. She made decisions about land. She appeared occasionally in the manorial courts on behalf of the household. The difference between a wife who managed while her husband was away and a widow who managed because her husband was gone was often nothing more than whether the man was expected to come back. The competence was the same. The authority was the same. Only the legal framework was different. And here is the detail that genuinely delights me. In the year 1240, Bishop Robert Grosseteste of Lincoln wrote a set of household rules for the widowed Countess of Lincoln, practical instructions for how to run a large noble estate. He told her to walk through every room of her household regularly to learn the name of every servant, to personally inspect the kitchens, the storerooms, the stables. Not to micromanage, but to know. Because the woman who knew the names of the people who worked for her and the state of the places those people worked, that woman could not be deceived, could not be robbed slowly by a dishonest steward, could not be blindsided by a failing harvest that someone else had seen coming for weeks. Knowledge was power. It was just a different kind of power than the kind written into law, so she learned. Through that first strange year in a house that was slowly becoming hers, holding keys that were slowly being trusted to her, managing a world that was slowly starting to respond to her voice, she learned. Not gracefully, not all at once, with mistakes and corrections and moments of quiet humiliation, when an older servant's expression made it clear that her decision was wrong. And with moments too small, private, uncelebrated moments, when something she organised worked exactly as it should, when the stores held through March when the winter ran long, when a servant she had recognised as skilled and trusted with more responsibility proved her judgment right, when a meal she had planned fed everyone in the hall, and the room was warm and the evening was ordinary and good. Those moments were not recorded anywhere. They left no trace in any archive, but they happened, and somewhere in that accumulation of ordinary competence, that growing certainty that she could do this, a girl who had arrived knowing almost nothing was becoming something she had not expected to become. A woman who ran a household, a woman who held the keys. What she did not yet know, what no one had told her exactly, was what was already changing inside her body. And that particular discovery, quiet, bewildering, enormous, was coming soon, very soon. Of all the things the Church inserted itself into during the Middle Ages, and there were many, trust me, perhaps none was more intimate, more intrusive, or more genuinely strange to the modern eye than what happened inside the marriage bed. Because the same institution that had blessed the wedding, that had declared the union a sacred sacrament, that had sanctified the feast and the prayers, and the ring on her hand, that same institution, then followed the couple into their bedroom and issued a rule book. And it was by any reasonable measure one of the most complicated rule books in human history. Let us start with what the church actually wanted from marital relations. The answer was simple: children. That was it. That was the entire point. Not companionship, not pleasure, not the expression of love between two people. Children. The theological framework behind this was not cruel in intention. It was, in the church's view, a protection against sin. If you were married and you had relations purely for pleasure, you were no better than an animal driven by appetite. But if you were married and your relations might produce new Christian souls, that was different. That was acceptable. That was almost noble. The problem was that pleasure and procreation have an annoying tendency to arrive together, and the church's solution to this uncomfortable fact was not to ignore it, but to bury it under such an elaborate architecture of rules that by the time a medieval couple had finished consulting the calendar, the moment had very likely passed. The Summa Confessorum, a handbook for confessors published in the early 13th century, laid out the specific times when marital relations were forbidden. No Sunday, no Thursday, no Friday, no feast days, no fast days of which the medieval calendar had rather a lot, no Lent 40 days before Easter, no Advent 40 days before Christmas, not during a woman's menstruation, not while she was nursing a child, not for 40 days after giving birth, not during pregnancy. When you add all of these restrictions together, and the historian Geoffrey Richards did exactly that calculation, the average medieval married couple was permitted to be intimate less than once per week, in a whole year. Take a moment to let that settle. The church had, through sheer accumulation of prohibited dates and conditions, reduced the lawful opportunity for marital relations to roughly 1 day in every 7 or 8. And even on those permitted days, there were rules about position, about intent, about the proper frame of mind. Historian James Brundage noted that according to church teaching, marital relations required, in his words, forethought deliberation and conscious reflection if one wished to avoid serious sin, which is not, historically speaking, a description of how most intimacy actually works. Now, I want to be honest about something before we go further. How many medieval people actually followed all of these rules? The honest answer, and it is well supported by the historical record, is probably not many. Evidence from the period suggests that ordinary people largely ignored the church's more elaborate prohibitions, especially the calendar restrictions. Priests complained from their pulpits that their parishioners treated the rules as suggestions. Confessors' handbooks occasionally noted with something approaching resignation that people seemed to need reminding that these rules existed at all. There is a quietly wonderful line from the preacher Vincent Ferrer, who was active in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, who reportedly claimed that by the age of 15 most young men in his community had already lost their virginity. He was scandalized. History finds him useful. The gap between what the church prescribed and what people actually did was apparently quite wide, and we should probably not be surprised by this. Human nature is not a variable that changes much across centuries, but here is the part that I think genuinely surprises people. The church gave with one hand and took with the other, at the same time that it was building this enormous architecture of restriction. It also established something called the conjugal debt. And the conjugal debt was in effect the exact opposite of everything else. It meant that within marriage a spouse had a right to intimate relations, not a request, not a polite inquiry, a right, and the other spouse had a legal canonical obligation to fulfill it. The word debt is precise and deliberate. It was borrowed directly from the language of financial obligation. You owed this to your spouse the way you owed a creditor money. Refusal without good cause was a sin. Canon lawyers of the 12th century debated this at length, whether the debt was equal for both spouses, whether illness excused it, whether a spouse's known infidelity changed the obligation. The consensus was that the debt was mutual. A husband owed his wife, a wife owed her husband, both had the right to claim it, both had the obligation to pay. I find this genuinely remarkable for its time. In a society that gave women almost no legal standing in a marriage where the wife's property became her husband's. On the wedding day, the Church had quietly embedded in its own theological language a principle of mutual sexual obligation that applied to both parties equally. It was not equality in any modern sense, but it was something. And here is where the story takes one of those turns that I genuinely enjoy telling, because it is almost impossible to believe until you look at the historical record yourself. If a husband could not fulfill the conjugal debt, if he was physically incapable of consummating the marriage, his wife had legal recourse. She could take him to court, and not just any court, an ecclesiastical court, a church court. She could petition for an annulment on the grounds of his inability to perform his marital duty. Now this may sound like a footnote, but the surviving records tell a different story. The courts of medieval England and France dealt with these cases in remarkable numbers. Historian Pierre Darmon, who spent years studying French ecclesiastical court records, wrote that by the 15th century, courts were facing what he called a tidal wave of such accusations, and the process that developed around these cases was one of the most extraordinary legal spectacles in the history of Western civilization. In England, when a wife brought her husband before a court on these grounds, the court would appoint a committee of women, specifically of honest women. The term in the records is consistent older respected women of good standing in the community who were charged with conducting a physical examination of the husband and reporting their findings back to the court. The records that survive from York in the year 1370 describe one such case in vivid clinical detail. 3 women examined a man named John Sanderson and reported back to the court that his member was, in their words, like an empty intestine of mottled skin lacking adequate veins. The marriage was annulled within days. 2 years later, in 1372, another case came before the same court. The husband in this case was not found outright incapable, but the examination concluded he could scarcely raise it. The court appointed women to help him through various remedies, including warming his body by the fire. None of it was sufficient. His wife was freed. I want to pause here because I think the weight of what we are reading deserves a moment of honest acknowledgement. These women, the wives in these cases, were navigating a world that had given them almost no tools for self-determination. They could not own property in their own right once married. They could not appear as witnesses in most civil courts. They could not pursue most legal remedies independently. But they could stand in front of a church tribunal and say, "My husband has not fulfilled his obligation. I am owed something. I want it accounted for." And in a narrow but real sense, the law agreed with them. In France, as the tradition developed, the cases grew even more elaborate, and in a few dozen of the most extreme instances, when the husband denied the accusation and demanded the right to prove himself, the court could order what became known as the trial by Congress, which was exactly what it sounds like. The husband and wife were brought to a room. Witnesses, physicians, surgeons, matrons, clerks gathered nearby or in the adjacent space. The couple was expected to demonstrate together that consummation was possible. The results were reported to the court. I am going to tell you about the Marquis de Langeais, because his case is one of the most documented and, in a dark way, one of the most human. The Marquis was accused by his wife in the year 1657 after 4 years of marriage. He was examined, declared physically capable, but the accusation held, and ultimately the Marquis Wounded pride, overriding every other instinct, demanded the trial by Congress to publicly vindicate himself. Paris, which had not asked to be involved, became absolutely consumed by this case. Bets were placed in taverns on the outcome. Satirical songs were written. Society ladies reportedly declared their open admiration for the Marquis. When the day arrived and the couple was brought to the appointed room, the Marquette reportedly called out to the assembled physicians, "Bring me 2 fresh eggs that I may get her a son at the first shot." 2 hours later he gave up. He was heard to be in the contemporary record, grunting, cursing, and finally praying. He retired from the trial defeated and from public life not long after. He later remarried and fathered 7 children. When he met a former enemy and boasted of this, the man replied with one of the driest lines in recorded history, "But sir, nobody has ever had any doubts about your wife." The Congress was abolished in France in the year 1677 by King Louis XIV, who declared it both scandalous and absurd. 20 years too late for the Marquis. Now, why am I telling you all of this? Because I think it illuminates something essential about the medieval wife and the world she inhabited. This was a world in which the most intimate parts of her marriage were theoretically subject to public theology, where a church handbook told her when she could and could not be with her husband, where the calendar of saints could regulate her private life, where if her marriage collapsed, a panel of women she had never met might be asked to examine her husband and decide her future. And yet, in all of this regulation, all of this oversight, all of this theological architecture, there were these odd flickering moments of real agency. The conjugal debt which said her needs mattered, the church court which said she could speak, the panel of honest women which said her testimony would be heard. The medieval world did not give women power, but it accidentally, almost against its own instincts, left a few doors unlocked. The question now is what was happening beyond those doors, what she was feeling, what she was thinking, what was quietly growing inside her in the weeks and months after she stepped into this marriage. Because something was, something that would soon make every other question in her life seem small by comparison. Something that was coming for her whether she was ready or not. Somewhere between the 4th and 5th month of her marriage something changed. She may not have been able to name it exactly. Not at first. There was fatigue that did not lift with rest. A queasy feeling in the early morning that seemed to have no cause. A sharpness in certain smells that she had never noticed before the tallow candles. The kitchen smoke, the particular earthiness of the grain stores. And then, most importantly, silence. The kind of silence that a woman in the 14th century had been taught since childhood to pay very close attention to. The monthly rhythm had stopped. She was in all probability pregnant. I want to sit with this moment a little longer than history usually does, because I think we tend to skip past it. We go straight to the birth, the danger, the drama, and we miss something essential about what this discovery meant to a medieval woman in the first year of her marriage. She did not have a test. She did not have a physician she could consult. Male physicians were by the conventions of the era largely excluded from anything involving women's reproductive health. She did not even have certainty. What she had was the absence of her cycle some troubling mornings, and whatever her mother, her mother-in-law, or the older women of her community had told her to watch for. And here is the thing that genuinely stopped me the first time I read it carefully, even if she suspected, even if the signs were accumulating the medieval understanding of pregnancy, held that a woman could not be truly definitively certain she was with child until the moment known as the quickening, the first movement, the first time the baby kicked, which happened on average somewhere around the 4th or 5th month. Think about what that means. She could be 4 or 5 months pregnant, visibly changed, physically affected, and the official accepted theological position was that the pregnancy was not yet fully confirmed. This was not ignorance exactly. This was a different understanding of what life meant and when it began. Medieval theologians, drawing on Aristotle, held that the soul entered the body in stages. The vegetative soul first, then the sensitive soul, then the rational. And it was only when the rational soul arrived, when the child first moved, first demonstrated a kind of will, that the pregnancy was fully real. That first kick was not just a physical event, it was in the medieval understanding the moment God sent a soul. The quickening, the name says everything. Now once the quickening had happened, once there was no longer any question, the world around her changed immediately. Women arrived. Not men. Women. The older ones. The experienced ones. The ones who had been through this themselves, or who had attended others through it, or who simply knew things that men did not know and were not supposed to ask about. And they brought with them a world of knowledge that was entirely separate from the official medical tradition. In the late 15th century, a remarkable document was compiled in Flanders and Picardy, a text called the Distaff Gospels. It records something that I find genuinely moving: 6 older women gathering over the long winter evenings, sitting together to spin and sharing between them over 200 pieces of advice on pregnancy, childbirth health, and the management of a woman's life. A male scribe recorded their words slightly mockingly, it must be said, but historians have established that what he wrote down was a genuine record of the oral tradition passed between medieval women in the privacy of their own spaces on the long evenings when the men were elsewhere. And some of that advice is tender, some of it is practical, some of it is bewildering, and a great deal of it is in its own way beautiful because it tells us that these women cared, desperately, practically, creatively, in the only ways available to them. Let me share some of it with you, because this is the voice of medieval women speaking almost directly across 600 years. If you wanted to know whether a woman was pregnant before the quickening arrived, the Distaff Gospels had a method. Ask her to urinate into a basin. Place a metal door latch, into the urine. Leave it there for 3 or 4 hours, then remove the latch and pour away the liquid. If you can see the impression of the latch left in the basin, she is pregnant. If not, she is not. I have thought about this test more than I probably should. It is not science in any modern sense, but it is observation. It is pattern recognition. It is the result of women watching, comparing, remembering, and building a body of knowledge from accumulated experience with no access to libraries, no access to formal training, no access to anything except each other. The Distaff Gospels also recorded advice for what to do once you knew. Give the pregnant woman whatever she craves to eat, immediately, without delay. Failing to do so could cause the child to be born with a birthmark in the shape of the food she wanted but was denied. I find this charming. It is also in its own pre-scientific way a recognition that pregnancy cravings are real, that the body of a pregnant woman is communicating something, and that the people around her should listen. Do not eat the head of a hare. Your child will be born with a split lip. Do not eat fish heads. The child's mouth will be turned up and pointed. Do not allow swords or sharp objects near the pregnant woman unless the text specifies with wonderful seriousness, you first touch her gently on the head with the flat of the blade. This will calm her, the text explains, and ensure that the future child will be brave. I want to pause on this particular piece of advice, because buried inside its strangeness is something real, the recognition that pregnancy was frightening, that a woman needed to be calmed, that sharp things were threatening, that her emotional state mattered for the outcome. Medieval medicine was wrong about almost all of the mechanisms, but it was not wrong that a pregnant woman's experience affected the health of her child. It was not wrong that she needed to feel safe. That at least was true. And then there were the predictions. One of the most urgent questions in any medieval pregnancy was not whether the child would be healthy. It was whether the child would be a boy. This is uncomfortable to sit with by modern standards, but honesty requires us to name it. In a world where property passed through the male line, where a family's continuation depended on a male heir, where the entire point of the marriage contract had been framed around the production of children who could inherit the pressure on a pregnant woman to produce a son was enormous, and entirely beyond her control, the Distaff Gospels offered methods to predict. Watch which foot the pregnant woman steps forward with first in the morning. Right foot a boy, left foot a girl. Watch how she holds herself. If her belly is carried high, and in front some said boy. If it spreads low and wide, some said girl. Ask her about her cravings. Meat and salt, some said boy. Sweetness and dairy, some said girl. Sound familiar because these same folk predictions are alive and well today. Your grandmother probably told you one of them. Your friend who is pregnant might have heard one last week. We have not changed that much. We still reach for pattern and meaning when faced with things we cannot control. But here is the thing that the Distaff Gospels understood, and that I think we should hold carefully. All of these rules and predictions and superstitions were not primarily about controlling the outcome. They were about giving women something to do, something active in the face of profound passivity. Something purposeful in the face of an experience that was happening to her body, whether she agreed to it or not. When the medieval world told a pregnant woman not to eat hare's head, not to look at fire too long, to clench her fist in a particular way if she wanted a boy, it was giving her the illusion of agency. And illusions of agency, it turns out, are not nothing. They reduce fear. They create structure. They allow a person to feel that they are participating rather than simply waiting. We do the same thing now. We just call it something different. We call it following the science. We download apps that tell us what fruit size the baby is this week. We avoid soft cheese and hot tubs. We are underneath it all still reaching for control over something that will unfold in its own way regardless of what we do. There is one more thing I want to tell you about medieval pregnancy before we move to what came next, and it is about the community of women that formed around her. When a medieval woman became visibly pregnant, something shifted in her social world. She moved more fully into the women's sphere, that domestic, enclosed, powerful, essentially invisible world that ran parallel to the public world of men, and that men were largely not permitted to enter. Older women checked on her. The midwife, if her family could access one, was already being consulted. Other women who had given birth shared what they knew. Female saints were prayed to, especially St. Margaret of Antioch, the patron of pregnant women, and those in labour whose legend involved surviving an encounter with a dragon by having the creature swallowed her whole and then burst from its belly unharmed, which medieval women understood as a metaphor so direct it barely needs explaining. What was being built around this pregnant woman was not medical care in any modern sense, but it was a network of care, of accumulated knowledge passed from body to body, voice to voice. And when the time came when the first contractions began and the household shifted into a different kind of urgency, that network would be everything. It would be the only thing standing between her and a world that had very few other tools for what was about to happen. What was about to happen was one of the most dangerous things a human being could experience in the medieval world, and she knew it. Every woman she'd ever known who had been through it had told her in the language of reassurance that is also, if you listen carefully enough, the language of warning you will be all right. God willing, you will be all right. We are going to talk about what that room looked like, what happened inside it, who was allowed in and who was not, and what it cost her to walk through the door. There is a legal record that survives from 15th century Belgium, a single line in a court document that I have never been able to get out of my head. It reads in translation, one Henner Vanden Dam for having hid behind a staircase to eavesdrop upon his wife, she being in labour of childbirth, which thing doth not befit a man, for the said eavesdropping was fined 15 livres. 15 livres, a significant sum of money, for listening, for daring to stand in his own house behind his own staircase and try to hear what was happening to his own wife on the other side of a door he was not permitted to open. He was fined for caring, or perhaps for curiosity, or perhaps just for being a man near a place where men were absolutely not supposed to be. That document tells you everything you need to know about what the lying-in chamber was. Let me set the scene properly, because this room, this singular, sealed, extraordinary room, is one of the most fascinating spaces in all of medieval history, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. When a noblewoman or a merchant's wife entered what was called the lying-in, she crossed a threshold that was in the fullest sense of the word a boundary. Behind her, the world of men, law, property, hierarchy, public life. In front of her, a room that belonged entirely to women. Tapestries hung over every window, not for decoration, to block out light. Only a single small opening would be left uncovered, and even that one was carefully managed, because it was believed that too much natural light could damage the eyes of a woman whose body was under such extreme stress. The room was kept warm, candles burned, sweet-smelling herbs, rosemary, lavender, dried flowers, were strewn on the floor or burned to fill the air with vapours that were believed to be health-giving. Crucifixes and sacred objects hung on the walls, images of the Virgin Mary, prayers written on small strips of parchment, and the tapestries themselves, when they depicted any scene at all, showed only calm things. Pastoral landscapes, gentle biblical scenes, nothing frightening, nothing violent, nothing with teeth. Because it was believed with absolute sincerity that what a woman saw during labour could mark her child permanently. This was not superstition for its own sake. This was an entire theory of maternal influence, the idea that the mother's experience, her fear, her vision, her emotional state passed directly into the child she was bringing into the world. The room had been designed to manage that influence, to hold the world still, to give her in the middle of the most physically overwhelming experience of her life, the most peaceful possible container. And then there was the midwife. I want to spend a moment on the midwife because she tends to be described in history as a kind of background character, a supporting role in someone else's story. This is exactly wrong. In the lying-in chamber, the midwife was the most powerful person in the room. Full stop. She outranked the mother. She outranked the mother's female relatives. She outranked anyone the husband might have sent a message to from the outside. She certainly outranked the husband himself, who was not present and had no say. Her tools were simple, her hands, her experience, her accumulated knowledge. She had learned from watching other midwives, often from childhood, often in the family. A midwife's daughter was frequently a midwife. The knowledge passed body to body, woman to woman, in exactly the same way that so much of women's knowledge passed in a world that largely kept women out of formal institutions. In England, by the later 14th century, individual midwives were beginning to be named in public records: Matilda Kember and Marjorie Josie, in Reading Felicia Tracy in Canterbury, women whose reputations were specific enough to be documented in the poll tax returns of 1377. These were not anonymous, they were known. People sought them out by name, and the midwife's authority extended beyond the birth itself. She was in the early medieval period, one of the only lay people authorized to perform baptism, because if a child was dying and no priest was present, the midwife could administer the sacrament herself to ensure the baby's soul went to heaven. Let me say that again because I think it deserves emphasis. In a world where women were barred from almost every position of religious authority, from the priesthood, From the episcopate, from virtually every official role in the church, the midwife held the power to perform a sacrament. Because in the chaos of a failing birth, in the pragmatic arithmetic of who was actually there, the church had conceded she is the one with the child in her hands. Let her do what needs to be done. You might be wondering, and I wonder this too sometimes, what's happening outside the room? What was the husband doing during the hours or days that could pass while his wife laboured behind a door he could not open? The records suggest praying. Miracle narratives from the 12th and 13th centuries, those collections of saintly intercessions that were compiled by monks and priests, describe husbands outside the lying-in chamber, sometimes distraught, sometimes desperate, vowing gifts to saints if only the birth would go well. In one account from the records of St. Thomas of Canterbury, a man named William, a knight from Oxford, whose wife Eleanor had been in labour for 3 days, and was by all accounts near death, pressed the relics of St. Thomas against her body through the door, or passed them to the women inside. She gave birth to a son. Both survived. The chronicler notes quietly that William felt a great deal of compassion for his wife, especially since she was not yet of an age that she should be to become a mother. That single line. In the middle of a religious text written to praise the power of a saint, a medieval monk paused to note that this woman was very young, and her husband was worried for her, and that this was in some way wrong. History is full of moments like that if you read slowly enough to find them. Now let me be honest with you about something, because I think the lying-in chamber tends to get a little romanticised, including by me a little just now. Yes, it was a female space. Yes, it was in its own way protected. Yes, the midwife had real authority there. But it was also a place where women went knowing that something between 1 in 20 and 1 in 10 of them would not walk back out. More than 1 in 3 women, by the estimates historians rely on most carefully, died during their childbearing years. Not every death was in the room itself. Infection, in the days after complications that developed slowly, but the room was where the danger concentrated. And every woman who entered it knew this, not as an abstract statistical fact, but as a personal lived knowledge. She had lost someone to this room before, a sister, a cousin, a neighbour whose name she still remembered, a woman from the village who went in and did not come out. The symbolic barriers were part of this too. When labour was difficult, when it stalled, when it seemed to be going wrong, the women attending would perform a set of rituals that had nothing to do with medicine, as we understand it, and everything to do with the belief that physical and spiritual worlds overlapped, cupboard doors were opened. Knots were untied, every knot in the room, including in clothing and in hair, because knots were believed to bind and tighten, and a birth that needed to open could not afford any tightening. Hairpins were removed, locks were unlocked. The whole architecture of the room was transformed into a kind of sympathetic magic. Make everything open, everything loose, everything yielding, and perhaps the body will follow. I find this remarkably moving, not because it works, but because of what it tells us about the human instinct to do something, anything, when faced with something we cannot control. They untied knots. We paced the waiting room. The anxiety is the same. Let me tell you about the birthing stool. By the 14th century, women in the lying-in chamber commonly gave birth not lying flat in a bed, but sitting upright on a low wooden stool designed specifically for this purpose, with the midwife kneeling or crouching in front of her. The midwife's tools included scissors, linens, and her own experienced hands. Women who attended the birth supported the labouring woman from behind, holding her, steadying her, speaking to her. The specific words that centuries of practice had determined were the right words for this moment. Do you have any idea how much knowledge is packed into that image? 5 or 6 women gathered around one woman in pain, using every resource they collectively possessed, physical, emotional, spiritual, practical, to bring a child safely into the world. No anesthesia, no monitoring equipment, no doctor on call, no way to know until it was over whether the outcome would be the one they hoped for. Just hands, just voices, just accumulated knowledge passed from woman to woman across generations so long they dissolved into the unrecorded past. There is something I want to ask you to consider. We tend to look at medieval medicine and see what was absent. The antiseptics, the surgical knowledge, the understanding of infection, all the things that would have saved so many lives if only someone had known them. And yes, all of that is true. But when I read the accounts of what actually happened in that room, the warmth, the darkness, the familiar faces the woman in the middle held by the women around her, the prayers and the candles and the untied knots, I also see something that we have largely lost. The community of women who believed that this moment was theirs to manage, who did not step back for an institution or defer to an authority, who said, "We know this. We have always known this. We will be here." We tend to think of female power in history as something that was suppressed from the beginning, and there is truth in that. But the lying in chamber was not suppressed. It persisted for centuries. It was the one secular space in the entire medieval world from which men were excluded by law, by custom, and by general agreement. The husband hiding behind the staircase, being fined 15 leaves for listening, he was being reminded of something the entire society had decided not here. This one is ours. She survived. I want you to know that. Our woman, the woman we have been following through this whole story, she came through it. She lay exhausted in the room that had held her. The child was wrapped in linen, baptized quickly in case it was fragile given its name. And now there were 40 more days before she could leave this room. 40 days before she could move back through the door that separated the world she had always known from the world that had changed forever. 40 days in which she was in some sense neither the woman she had been before nor yet fully the woman she was about to become. What happened in those 40 days and what happened to that baby, that is what comes next. 40 days. That number carries more weight than it might first appear. In the biblical tradition, 40 was always a number of transition. 40 days of rain that reshaped the world. 40 years in the wilderness. 40 days of fasting before something new could begin. And now here she was, 40 days of stillness in a room that had witnessed something sacred and terrifying, before she could step back into the world. Not as the woman she was before, not quite. As someone who had passed through something that most people in the medieval world acknowledged without fully having language for it, the threshold between one kind of existence and another. What those 40 days actually looked like depended enormously on who she was. For a noble woman, they were in a certain reading something close to rest. She stayed in the lying-in chamber or her private rooms. Female companions attended her. She did not manage the household, did not appear in public, did not carry the weight of the ordinary daily machine she normally ran. The world, briefly unusually, was asked to proceed without her. For a merchant's wife, it was somewhere in between. Some recovery, some stillness, but also the nagging awareness of what was not getting done. For a peasant woman, and the records are honest about this, there was often no 40 days at all. Not really. The animals needed feeding. The work did not stop. A woman who had given birth yesterday might be back on her feet within days because there was simply no one else. What the 40 days represented more than anything else was a social aspiration. The recognition that a woman who had just given birth deserved a period of recovery and protection. But it was an aspiration that the realities of medieval economic life could not always afford to honour. And then there was the question of the baby. Let me tell you something that genuinely stops people cold the first time they encounter it. In medieval England by the 12th century, and increasingly into the 13th and 14th, the Church strongly encouraged baptism within hours of birth, not days, hours, because roughly 30% of babies born in medieval Europe died before their first birthday. 30%, and the theological stakes of a child dying unbaptized were in the medieval understanding enormous. An unbaptized infant could not enter heaven. It would remain in a kind of permanent spiritual limbo, not punished but not saved, outside the gates of everything the parents had prayed for. So the midwife, as we touched on before, had authority to baptize in emergencies, and fathers in the panicked hours after a difficult birth would rush the child to the nearest priest, before they had even had time to process what had just happened. One of the stranger consequences of this is that the mother was almost never present at her own baby's baptism. She was still confined. The child received its name and its sacrament in the church while she remained in the room where she'd given birth. She heard about it afterward. She was told what name had been chosen, often by the godparents, who had significant influence over the naming, what the priest had said, how the child had responded. Think about that. The most important ritual moment in her baby's early life, the moment that determined its eternal fate, by the theology she lived by, and she was not there. She had given the child to the world, and the world had claimed it immediately, and the children who survived. An estimated 30% died before their first birthday. A further 20% did not survive to adulthood. Those are the aggregate numbers. For individual families, the reality could be even more brutal. King Edward I and his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, had 16 children. 7 of them died before the age of 7. Of 5 sons, only the last born in 1284 lived to inherit the throne. Catherine of Siena's mother gave birth to at least 23 children. 8 of them survived to adulthood. These were royal and noble families, people with the best available food, the best available care, access to midwives and physicians, and the prayers of entire cathedrals. The mortality rates among ordinary families were not better. They were often worse. I want to sit with something here for a moment, because this is the part of medieval history that modern people often approach at a slight emotional distance, almost clinically, and I think that distance is a mistake. There is a historian named Philip Ariès, who argued in a book published in the 1960s that medieval parents did not love their children in the way we love ours, that they kept emotional distance as a protective mechanism, that the high mortality rates had created a culture of detachment. This theory was influential for a while. It has since been thoroughly dismantled. The evidence that survives the miracle narratives the coroner records, the fragments of correspondence, tells a completely different story. The Italian poet Petrarch, who lived in the 14th century, wrote about the death of his infant grandson, in language that has not aged a single day. My love for that child so filled my breast, that I cannot think that I ever loved anything else on earth so much. Medieval illuminated manuscripts show mothers holding their babies, looking down at them with an expression that anyone who has held a child will recognize immediately. The medical texts of the period, the same ones we've been reading throughout this story, included detailed advice about how to play with infants, how to stimulate their attention with interesting objects, how to encourage them to walk safely. One physician named Savonarola advised mothers to call her name or offer her a tempting object to encourage a toddler's first steps, and warned always to be ready to catch her when she fell. These are not the instructions of a culture that did not care. These are the instructions of people who loved their children and were terrified of losing them, and were doing everything in their limited power to prevent it. Somewhere in those 40 days in the room with the child baptized and named with the household, continuing without her, with her body recovering from what it had been through, she held her baby. for all the paperwork that had surrounded her marriage, for all the laws and the church doctrine and the household management and the calendar of forbidden days and the financial negotiations, this was the part that none of it had prepared her for. The weight of a person in your arms who had not existed a week ago. The specific terror of something that fragile. The love that arrives before you have names for it. Medieval parents grieved their children. Terribly. Specifically. There are miracles recorded in the names of individual children, a child named Thomas, who died of fever at 4 years old, a daughter named Alice, who did not survive her second winter. Named, mourned, prayed for. Their parents knelt at saints' shrines and asked for miracles on their behalf with a desperation that reads across 700 years as entirely recognizable. And then the 40 days ended. She dressed in her best clothes, she wore a white veil, she walked to the church. This ceremony, which the church called the churching of women, was officially described as a purification, a ritual cleansing before the new mother could return to full participation in religious and social life. Modern readings often emphasize the troubling theology embedded in this, the implication that childbirth had made her somehow unclean, that she needed to be restored to grace before she could sit in the pews again, and that critique is valid. The theology of female impurity after childbirth was real, and it was uncomfortable, and many women felt its weight as something diminishing rather than uplifting. But the historian Natalie Knoedel found something else too, looking at how women themselves described the churching ceremony. They looked forward to it. Not the theology of purification, not the implication of impurity, but the occasion itself. Because churching was in practice as much a social event as a religious one. It was the day when the community gathered around the new mother, when her female friends and relatives accompanied her to the church, when the ceremony was explicitly, formally, entirely about her, not about the baby, not about the husband, about this woman and what she had done and that she had survived it. The historian David Cressy, writing about this period, found a phrase in the records that I think is extraordinary in its customary operation. Churching was her occasion, even if the church had tried to make it theirs. She had walked in through the door dressed for the occasion. The priest had sprinkled her with holy water. Psalm 23 had been read, not a penitential psalm, but a psalm of arrival, of reaching a destination, of being led to a place of rest after the wilderness. And afterward there was often a feast, a small gathering, her female companions, a recognition, modest but genuine, of what she had accomplished. There is something I find remarkable about all of this viewed from this distance. The medieval world surrounded the first year of a wife's marriage with an architecture of control and obligation, the financial negotiations, the church rules, the expectations of the household, the requirements of her body, the demands of her role. And yet, scattered through all of that were these small pockets of recognition, the conjugal debt that acknowledged her needs, the lying in chamber where men were not permitted, the midwife who held the authority, the churching that whatever the church intended the women who experienced it turned into their own occasion. She had been in a marriage for less than a year. She had survived a birth. She had brought a child into a world that might or might not keep it. She had managed a household. She had learned the keys. She had navigated a new family, a new space, a new identity. And now she stood at the church door in her white veil as the priest welcomed her back into the world, back into the role, back into the life she was still only beginning to understand. But what was that life really? Beyond the ceremony and the rules and the fear and the love, what did it mean to hold the hidden power that a medieval wife actually possessed? Because we have been dancing around something for this entire story. We have seen glimpses of it in the keys she held in the household she managed in the courts where she sometimes appeared. But we have not yet named it directly. We have not yet asked the question that I think matters most. Was a medieval wife a victim of the world she lived in, or something altogether more complicated and more interesting? That question is coming right now. Let me ask you something directly. When you picture a medieval woman, and I mean really picture her, not just the abstract idea of her, what do you see? Probably something that looks a little like this. Passive, confined, obedient. A figure in a long dress with her eyes down. Someone things happen to rather than someone who made things happen. The history books have not always helped with this. For a long time, women's history of the medieval period was written largely by men about extraordinary exceptions, queens, saints, notorious figures with the ordinary woman as background scenery. And what I want to do in this part of the story is dismantle that image as carefully as I can. Not because I want to pretend the medieval world was fair to women. It was not. But because the picture of medieval women as uniformly powerless is simply historically inaccurate, and the truth is so much more interesting. Let us start with something concrete. In medieval England, before the Black Death of the mid-14th century, the vast majority of people who brewed and sold ale, the dominant drink in a world where water was often unsafe, were women. Not some women, not a few women. Women as a group essentially owned this industry. The word for these women was alewives, and the records that survive guild payments, court rolls, market accounts, tell a story that genuinely surprises people. Alewives ran businesses, they managed labourers, they paid guild taxes in their own names independently of their husbands. They appeared in court to defend the quality and pricing of their product. They accumulated money. Some of them accumulated a great deal of money. The ale they sold was not a luxury, it was a staple, consumed daily by virtually everyone, up to a gallon per person per day in some estimates, not because medieval people were perpetually drunk, but because ale was often safer and more nutritious than the available alternatives, and because it could be kept briefly where water could not. The woman who brewed and sold this product held in her own modest way an essential position in the local economy. And then after the Black Death changed everything, after the labour markets shifted, after capital became more concentrated, after the ale trade professionalised and commercialised, men moved in. The industry consolidated. The guilds that had once accommodated women began systematically excluding them. By the 15th century, alewives were being mocked in church murals depicted as condemned souls in hell, cheating their customers, disobeying their husbands, belonging on the wrong side of eternal judgment. The transition from respected profession to figure of ridicule and condemnation did not happen because the women had changed. It happened because the trade had become lucrative enough for men to want to dominate it, and the most efficient way to push women out was to redefine their presence as improper. This pattern, women holding an economic space becoming valuable men arriving, and women being pushed out, is one of the recurring rhythms of medieval women's history. But here is what I want to emphasize: for the period when women held it, they actually held it. The alewife was not a romantic exception. She was everywhere. She was the woman down the road from every medieval household. She was possibly your medieval wife's neighbour or her mother, or if circumstances aligned her. And she was only one example. Think for a moment about what happened to a medieval wife when her husband left. Not permanently, not death. We'll get to that, but temporarily. When he went to war, or on a long trading journey, or to attend court, or simply when the economic demands of the estate took him elsewhere for months. What happened to the household? She ran it. Not as a temporary caretaker keeping things warm until he returned, as the person in charge, negotiating with tenants, managing the harvest decisions, settling disputes among the household staff, corresponding with merchants, making decisions about which repairs to fund and which to defer. The manorial court records of England, Those remarkable documents that historians have spent generations reading are full of women acting in exactly this capacity, acting as their husband's legal representative, receiving payments owed to the estate, initiating legal proceedings. Blanche de Aulnesnels, a merchant's daughter who married a castle lord in 14th century Spain, appears in the surviving documents as having received homage from peasants, issued loans to the city government, served as the sole witness to legal documents, and acted as her husband's representative in meetings with church officials, all while her husband was alive and present. She was not a widow exercising emergency powers. She was a wife doing what needed to be done, because she was capable and present and the work demanded it. And then there were the ones who defended castles. This is where medieval women's power becomes impossible to dismiss. In 1217, a woman named Nicola de la Haye, who was then somewhere around 60 years old, successfully defended Lincoln Castle against an army backed by the French Prince Louis, whose ambitions in England were at the time very serious indeed. She had been defending this castle in one capacity or another for most of her adult life. In 1191, while her husband was elsewhere supporting Prince John, she had defended it against a siege that lasted over 40 days. The chronicler of her defence wrote, and I love this phrase more every time I read it, that Nicola had proposed to herself nothing effeminate, and defended the castle like a man. He meant it as a compliment. We might reasonably point out that she was in fact defending the castle like a woman, specifically like the woman who had been running and defending this particular castle for her entire adult life, and was therefore more qualified to do it than most men the chronicler would have known. After the 1217 battle, which is considered by historians to have been a turning point in preventing a French takeover of England, Nicola was removed from her position 4 days later and replaced by the king's uncle. She travelled to court, reminded the king's regents of what she had done, and had her castle restored to her. She died peacefully at home in 1230. History barely remembers her. History should not have forgotten her at all. Let us step back even further and look at the question of legal standing. On paper, the law was stark. A married woman in medieval England lost most of her independent legal identity upon marriage. Her property became her husband's. She could not make contracts or sue in her own name in most common law courts. She was in the legal term of the period a feme covert, a woman covered legally subsumed within her husband. This was real. This was not decoration. The legal disability of married women was genuine and limiting. But here is what the law on paper does not tell you what actually happened in practice, because medieval legal reality was considerably messier than medieval legal theory. Married women appeared as witnesses in courts. They made donations to religious institutions. They initiated disputes in ecclesiastical courts. We've seen this already. They bought and sold in markets. They signed documents. They carried on trades. And in areas like the London silk trade, married women could obtain something called the status of feme sole, a legal category that allowed them to act as independent traders, responsible for their own contracts and debts, even while their husbands were living. The gap between what the law said women could not do and what women were actually doing in markets, courts, and commerce was wide enough to drive a cart through. And then somewhere at the edge of all of this, sitting at a desk in Paris in the early years of the 15th century, was a woman who decided to write it all down. Her name was Christine de Pizan. She was born in Venice in 1364. Her father was an astrologer to the French king. She married young by arrangement to a royal secretary named Etienne. It was by every account she left a happy marriage. She described him as a man who encouraged her education, remarkable in itself, and who treated her, in her own words, with tenderness. Then the plague took him. In 1389, she was 25 years old. She had 3 children, a widowed mother and niece, debts, complicated lawsuits over her husband's unpaid salary. and virtually no legal standing to pursue any of it. What she did next is one of my favourite stories in all of medieval history. She picked up a pen, not as an amateur, not as a hobby. She became, and this is a claim historians have carefully documented, the first professional woman writer in the history of medieval Europe. She wrote poems for the court. They were received well. She wrote longer works. They were commissioned. She wrote biography, philosophy, history, political theory, military strategy. She was so popular that King Henry IV of England invited her to join his court. She declined. She considered him a usurper of the country that was waging war against France. I think about that a lot. A woman with no legal standing, no husband, no institutional support, turning down an invitation from a king because she found him politically objectionable. And in 1304 she finished the work she is most remembered for, the Book of the City of Ladies. It was in effect a systematic argument against every misogynist text that had been circulating through medieval Europe, and there were many. A best-selling poem called The Romance of the Rose had spent decades cheerfully cataloguing women's failings. Christine de Pizan read it, got annoyed, and wrote a counter-argument that would outlast its target by 600 years. The Book of the City of Ladies was shared across Europe, translated into multiple languages, read by queens and noblewomen who kept copies in their private libraries. Elizabeth I of England had one. A woman widowed at 25 with no legal standing and 3 children to feed had made herself indispensable to the intellectual life of an entire continent. I want to hold all of this together for a moment. The alewife who ran a business, Nicolas de la Haye who defended a castle, Blanche de Ulsnel who received homage from peasants, Christine de Pizan who turned down a king, the unnamed wife in every medieval household who ran the estate while her husband was away, and handled it better than many men who had legal authority to do the same thing. None of these women had what we would recognize as equality. None of them operated in a world that named their power officially or protected it consistently in law. But they all had something. They had the gap between what the law said and what life required. They had competence that was difficult to dismiss even when a society had reasons to dismiss it. They had networks of women, of servants, of tenants, of neighbours that existed outside the official structures and sometimes mattered more. And they had the knowledge that the person inside the gate was more important than the name on the deed outside it. Now, does this mean that the medieval wife was not constrained? Of course not. The constraints were real and often crushing. Does it mean that every woman had these opportunities? No. The woman at the very bottom of the social hierarchy had essentially none of them. But it means that the story of medieval women is not a story of uniform passive victimhood. It is something more complicated, something more human, something that looks in certain lights remarkably like the story of people in every era making the best of what their world offered, and sometimes reshaping what their world offered to include a little more than it had before. Which brings us finally to the question we've been circling the entire time without quite landing on it. The question of what happened inside all of this, not the structure, not the law, not the power dynamics, but the interior life, the love, or the absence of it, or the complicated, ambivalent, slowly developed thing that did not begin as love, and sometimes ended up as something indistinguishable from it anyway. Did medieval couples actually fall in love with each other? And if they did, what did that look like in a world that never promised them they would? That question is coming next. There is a letter in the British Library written in the year 1477 that stops me every single time I encounter it. It was dictated by a young woman named Marjorie Brews to the man she hoped to marry, a gentleman named John Paston III. John had been looking for a wife for over a decade. He was in his early 30s. Marjorie was younger. Their fathers were negotiating. The money was not quite working out. And in the middle of all of this financial calculation, Marjorie sat down with a scribe and said something that has never lost its power in 600 years. She called him her right well beloved Valentine. This is the first documented use of the word Valentine to mean a romantic beloved in the English language, not a category invented by greeting card companies, not a Victorian sentiment dressed up in medieval clothes. A young woman in 15th century Norfolk in the middle of a marriage negotiation that was mostly about money reaching past all of it, to call someone by a name that meant I choose you. Now let me be honest with you because I think this letter deserves the full context. Marjorie did not write it herself. She dictated it to a scribe, which was entirely standard for the period. Most people use scribes for formal correspondence, even people who are literate. The letter was almost certainly part of the negotiation process, not separate from it. Marjorie's mother, Elizabeth Bruce, was actively lobbying her husband to accept John's terms. The letter's survival suggests it was kept as documentation evidence of consent, evidence of commitment. Historians have thought carefully about all of this. Does the formal context diminish the emotion? Was Marjorie being used by her family to soften John's resistance with the language of love? The historian Rachel Moss, who has written about this letter, extensively makes a point I find completely convincing. We have no reason to think Marjorie's feelings were not genuine. She claimed those words under her own name. She sent them. She was asking for this man specifically. And then there is what happened afterward. They married that year. 7 years later, in 1484, with several children between them, years of ordinary domestic life, years of the kind of daily grind that wears down sentiment everywhere, Marjorie wrote to John, who was away on business in London. She asked him to send for her if he planned to stay long, and in a postscript, casual, almost offhand, tucked at the end of a letter full of practical matters, she wrote that she thought, "It is a long time since I lay in your arms." She called him in that letter, "my own sweetheart." 7 years into a marriage that began as a financial negotiation, with children, with estate problems, with all the weight of medieval daily life. My own sweetheart. This is the part of medieval marriage that we rarely talk about because it does not fit neatly into either of the narratives we prefer. The cynical narrative says medieval marriage was transactional, loveless, arranged, pragmatic. Love was for troubadours and poets. It had nothing to do with real life. The Romantic narrative says, of course, people fell in love even in the Middle Ages, just look at the literature. Both of these are half true, and neither one is the full picture. The concept of courtly love finamors, as the Provençal poets called it, refined love, elevated love, the love that ennobles the soul, originated in the courts of southern France in the 11th century and spread across Europe through troubadours and their songs. It was at its core love as performance, love as an expression of noble character. A knight devoted himself to a lady usually inaccessible, usually already married, not primarily to possess her, but to become better through the devotion. Andreas Capellanus, writing in the 12th century, codified the rules of this kind of love in elaborate detail. One of his most famous assertions was that true love was essentially incompatible with marriage, because love required longing, uncertainty, striving, and marriage resolved all of those. You could not yearn for someone you already had. This was the cultural background against which every medieval couple lived. The great love stories all happened outside marriage or before it. Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde. The love that the literature celebrated was structurally incompatible with the institution it coexisted with, and yet Geoffrey Chaucer spent most of his career writing about this contradiction from every possible angle. His wife of Bath, that irrepressibly alive, infuriatingly frank creation, had been married 5 times. She talked about her marriages with a directness that scandalized and probably delighted his original audience in equal measure. She talked about power in marriage. She talked about desire in marriage. She talked in the most unromantic language possible about the thing the courtly love tradition had decided to pretend did not exist, the reality of what it actually felt like to live with someone day after day, year after year, in the particular intimacy of medieval domestic life. Chaucer was not sentimental about marriage. He was something better. He was honest about it. He understood that love, if it came, did not look like the troubadour's poetry. It looked like Marjorie Brews writing, "It is a long time since I lay in your arms." It looked like something built slowly out of shared labour and shared fear and shared children, and the small daily accumulations of a life lived together. Now, is this what our woman experienced? The woman we have been following throughout this story, who survived the negotiation, the wedding, the first morning in a strange house, the keys and the household and the lying in chamber and the churching. Did she fall in love with the man she had married? I do not know. The historical record cannot tell me. But I know this: the medieval world had more ideas about love than we give it credit for. The Church, which in most matters seemed to view love between spouses as a slightly suspicious concession to human weakness, also produced some of its most eloquent defenders. The English Benedictine monk Matthew Paris wrote in the 13th century that a proper marriage required 3 things. Law connects them love and sexual compatibility. St. Augustine, whose influence on medieval theology was enormous, held that the love between a married couple was a reflection, however small, of divine love, that when a husband and wife looked at each other with genuine tenderness, something of God was present in the room. And then there was the theologian Peter Abelard, who is mostly remembered now for his catastrophic affair with Eloise, his student, his intellectual match, his great love, who ended as his wife in a secret ceremony, and then as a nun in a convent when her uncle exacted a brutal revenge. Abelard spent the rest of his life writing theology and arguing, among other things, that marital intimacy was not merely tolerated by God, but could be a vehicle of divine grace. The man who had paid the highest possible personal price for falling in love spent his intellectual life insisting that love was not incompatible with holiness. I find that quietly extraordinary. Let me tell you about the Paston family one more time, because they are in many ways the most complete picture we have of what medieval love actually looked like from the inside. Not the idealized version, not the literary version, the real version with all its complications and silences and unexpected tenderness. There was another Marjorie in the Paston family, not Marjorie Brews, but Marjorie Paston, a different woman from an earlier generation. She fell in love with Richard Carley. Richard Carley was the family steward, a trusted employee, a capable man, and by every social measure entirely unsuitable for a daughter of the Paston household. When her family discovered the attachment, they were furious. Her mother, the formidable Margaret Paston, did everything in her power to prevent the marriage. She appealed to the bishop. She threatened. She pleaded. She applied all the social pressure available to her. The bishop summoned Marjorie and examined her. He asked her directly had she contracted herself to Richard Carley. What words had they exchanged, she told him. She repeated back to the bishop what she had said to Richard and what Richard had said to her. The bishop, who was apparently a careful man, concluded that the words she described constituted a valid marriage. Under canon law, which required only mutual consent, they were already bound. Margaret Paston did not forgive her daughter. Marjorie was effectively cut off from the family. She and Richard lived their lives separately from the Paston household that had organised and defined everything she had known. Was it worth it? The records do not say. What they say is that she married the man she chose. In a world that had given her almost no legal standing to make such a choice, she made it anyway. I keep coming back to this question. Do you feel it too, this tension between what the medieval world promised and what it actually delivered? It promised this marriage is a contract. It delivered sometimes this marriage is my life. It promised you will marry for the family, for property, for alliance. It delivered sometimes you will make something with this person that neither of you expected and that neither of you has words for. The medieval world was not unaware of this gap. It filled it with literature, with songs and poems and romances that celebrated the love the institution of marriage kept insisting was not supposed to be part of the deal. And then actual people like Marjorie Brews, like Marjorie Paston, like Christine de Pizan, who wrote of her husband with a grief that reads as deeply personal across 600 years, went ahead and felt it anyway. There is a line in Chaucer's Franklin's Tale that I have read many times and always find the same thing in it. A knight and his wife have made a remarkable agreement, that neither will claim authority over the other, that each will treat the other with the kind of consideration that makes tyranny impossible. The Franklin Chaucer's narrator, a comfortable, prosperous man who understands the realities of domestic life, very well offers a commentary on this arrangement, that Chaucer gives him with unusual care. Love will not be constrained by mastery. Not love cannot survive constraint, that would be a political argument. Love will not be constrained by mastery. It is a statement about love's nature, about what love is, about what it requires. And it is in a poem about marriage, written in the 14th century, by a man who understood as well as anyone of his era the difference between what marriage was supposed to be and what it actually was when it was at its best. By the end of her first year of marriage, our woman had learned a great deal. She had learned the household. She had learned the keys. She had survived the thing in the room that no one could prepare her for. She had walked back out into the daylight after 40 days of stillness. She had begun to understand what the world would ask of her for the rest of her life, and somewhere in all of that, in the quiet accumulation of days that had no names in the historical record, perhaps she had begun to understand something else, about the man she'd been given to, or chosen, or some complicated combination of the two, about whether what grew between them was what the poets described, or something older, quieter, and more durable than that. We're almost at the end of this story. One part remains, and it is the part that has been waiting since we watched her walk out of her father's house on the morning everything changed. The question of who she had become, not the girl who arrived, not yet the woman she would fully be, but the person standing at the end of her first year, having learned things, survived things, lost things, discovered things, looking back down the road she'd come. What did that look like from the inside? Let us find out. A year, just 1 year, 365 days give or take. That is how long we've been following her. From the negotiation table to the wedding day, from the first morning in the strange house to the keys in her hand, from the quickening to the lying in chamber, to the churching ceremony in her white veil and her best dress. And I want to stop here right at the edge of where the story ends and ask a question that I think deserves a real answer. After all of that, after everything the first year of a medieval marriage contained, who was she? Not who she had been, who she had become. Let us start with the legal reality because it is striking. On the day she was married, something happened to her in the eyes of the law that I think deserves to be named plainly. She disappeared, not literally, not in the ways that mattered for daily life, but in the specific technical language of the common law of England, in the doctrine called coverture from the Norman French word for covered. She ceased upon marriage to exist as a separate legal person. The medieval legal treatise known as Bracton put it directly: husband and wife are one flesh, one blood, one legal person, and that one person in practice was the husband. Before marriage, an unmarried woman in England had what the law called the status of feme sole, a woman alone a legal individual in her own right. She could own property, make contracts, sue in court. Her legal standing was in most respects equivalent to a man's. The moment she married, that identity was covered. She became feme covert, a covered woman. The protection of the law, it was said, was the husband's to offer. He was her legal voice in most courts. Her property upon marriage became his. And here is the thing that I find quietly extraordinary about this legal framework. It was not primarily about control. It was about unity. The law genuinely believed it was describing love, that two people in a marriage were so completely one, that dividing them into separate legal entities was a kind of theological error. The fact that unity in practice meant the woman's identity was absorbed into the man's, rather than the reverse that was apparently just a detail. But you already know from everything we have discussed that legal theory and lived reality were never the same thing. In towns like London, Bristol, Lincoln, York, and a dozen others, married women could operate as feme-sole merchants, running independent businesses, owning their own finances, suing and being sued in their own names, even while their husbands were alive and present. The custom was written into London's legal records by Lord Mayor Henry Darcy in the 1330s. A married woman working independently of her husband could act as a single woman in all matters concerning her trade. She could rent a shop, she could carry debt, she could protect her business interests in court without her husband's involvement or approval. Not in every jurisdiction, not for every woman, but in enough places for enough women to demonstrate what the historians have spent decades establishing, that coverture was less a wall than a fence, one you had to navigate rather than simply accept. There is something else about coverture that I want to name because it tends to get lost in the legal discussion. The doctrine said upon marriage the woman was covered by her husband, protected, and in a world with no police force worth mentioning, no formal social safety net, no institutional mechanism for protecting a woman travelling alone or a widow whose neighbours decided her land was actually theirs, protection was not nothing. The same legal framework that silenced a woman's voice in court also meant that her husband was legally responsible for her debts, legally obligated to maintain her, legally answerable for a great deal of what happened to her. It was not a fair trade, but it was a trade, and understanding it as one as a transaction with real costs on both sides is more historically honest than understanding it as simple oppression. Which is not to say it was good. It was not always good. Some women experienced coverture as pure loss, absorbed into marriages that offered them no protection at all and a great deal of harm. But the medieval mind that designed this system genuinely believed it was building something protective. That belief does not redeem its consequences, but it is part of understanding how medieval people understood their own lives. So she had lost her legal name. She had lost the independent legal standing she had held, however theoretically, before the wedding. What had she gained? Let me count. She had gained a household, not metaphorically, literally, the physical material reality of a home that was in practice, if not in law, hers to manage. The food in the stores, the fire in the hearth, the servants whose work she directed, the rhythm of daily life that she was now responsible for shaping. She had gained a position in the community. Before marriage, a young woman occupied a transitional social space important to her family, valuable to potential alliances but not yet anchored. A married woman, a wife, was a different category. She was recognized. She had standing. She could speak in the complicated social hierarchy of the village or the town with an authority she had not possessed before. She had gained a specific and recognized role in the most important project of medieval society, the continuation of human life. She had carried a pregnancy. She had survived a birth. She had brought a child into the world. In a society where the entire structure, the land, the titles, the alliances, the church depended on the succession of generation after generation, the woman who had done this was not peripheral. She was foundational, and there is something else, something I keep circling back to, something that does not fit neatly into either the legal history or the social history. She knew things. After a year, she knew things that she had not known before. She knew which servant was reliable and which needed watching. She knew which merchant in the market could be trusted, and which one had a habit of short measuring the grain. She knew how long the stores could last through a hard winter. She knew what her body was capable of. She knew how to manage a household that had seemed impossibly complex when she first arrived. This knowledge was not recorded anywhere. It did not appear in any legal document. It did not give her any formal power. And yet, a man who did not listen to it made worse decisions than a man who did. A household that ignored it ran less efficiently than one that respected it. A community that pretended these women had nothing to contribute was lying to itself. The medieval world knew this. It did not always say so, but it knew. There is a will that has survived from later medieval England, written by a man named Oliver Leader, in which he describes his wife. He says he is very sorry, in the beautiful old spelling that for her, wise and womanly governance and most loving and honest behaviour towards me at all times since our marriage I have not. And here the will is incomplete. We do not know what he felt he had not done, what he should have given her, what he had neglected to express, but what is recorded is the rest of the sentence. The acknowledgement, the recognition of a person who had been beside him managing his household, governing wisely, behaving honestly through the entire span of their marriage. He saw her. He was sorry he had not shown it better. He wrote it in a legal document so there would be no question. This is a single will from a single man. But historians working on this period have found patterns like it scattered through the records, men who expressed at the end of their lives or in moments of crisis an appreciation for their wives that the official language of their era had almost no vocabulary to contain. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it. Does any of what we've covered tonight, the financial negotiations, the legal disappearance, the keys and the household, the room, with the sealed windows, the churching, the daily labour that left no trace in any archive, does any of it remind you of anything? Because I keep thinking as I work through this material that the distance between us and these women is smaller than we imagine, not the circumstances. The circumstances are different, not the specific constraints. Those have changed enormously, and that matters. But the thing underneath all of it, the experience of arriving somewhere new and having to learn to manage it, of doing work that the world will not officially acknowledge, of holding a household together through a combination of competence and care that nobody has a title for that part, has not changed as much as we might like to think. What changed at the end of the first year was this: she was no longer new. That is not a small thing. The person who had arrived at that door uncertain, possibly frightened, carrying the weight of a negotiation she had not been allowed to participate in, was gone. In her place was someone who had survived approximately everything the medieval world could throw at a person in 12 months. Someone who knew the household, who held the keys, who had navigated the complicated social territory of her new family, who had carried a life inside her body and brought it safely into the world. She had not gained legal standing. She had not gained the right to vote or to own property or to speak in most courts. The world had not become fair, but she had become, in the only way that actually mattered day to day, the most important person in the building. I've been sitting with this story for a long time, and the thing I keep returning to, the thing that seems most important to me, the thing I want to leave you with, is not the injustice of it. Though the injustice is real and worth naming, it is not the hardship. Though the hardship was considerable, it is not even the surprising resilience, though that is genuine and remarkable. It is this: every woman who lived this story was doing something that most of history has treated as invisible, She was building a world, not the world of kings and battles and legal documents, the world of fires kept burning and children kept alive and households kept running through one winter and another until the accumulation of those ordinary acts became the foundation on which everything else was built. Medieval theology said that Eve's curse had made women suffer. Medieval law said that wives had no independent existence. Medieval literature said that love belonged to troubadours, not to households, and none of it was accurate. Not entirely. Not when you look at the actual women. Not when you look at Nicola de la Haye defending her castle at 70, or Marjorie Bruce calling someone her sweetheart 7 years into a marriage, or Christine de Pizan building a city of ladies out of words with 3 children and no legal standing and the whole weight of the world's indifference, or our woman, the one we've been following all night, standing at the end of her first year holding the keys, knowing the stores having survived the room. No one prepared her for looking at the person in the mirror of still water and seeing someone she did not quite recognize yet. Someone who had not chosen any of this. Someone who had done it anyway. We've almost reached the end. One part remains, and it is the part where we step back from the whole story, all 12 months of it, and ask the question that the whole story was always moving toward. What does this mean, not then, now, for us, for the way we think about women, about marriage, about the invisible work that holds the world together? That reflection is just ahead. Pull back for a moment, not from the story, from the world. Imagine you're standing somewhere quiet, a field maybe in the English countryside. It is sometime in the 14th century. The air smells like wet grass and wood smoke, and in a farmhouse at the edge of the field, a woman is awake before dawn. She's been awake before dawn every day for a year. She does not think of herself as remarkable. She does not have a title. She will not be recorded in any chronicle. No monk will write her name in a manuscript. No king will remember she existed. She's just doing what needs to be done, which is the most extraordinary thing anyone ever does. I want to talk in this final part of our story about what the first year of a medieval marriage actually tells us, not just about the past, but about the present. Because I believe history is only useful when it changes how you see the world you live in. Otherwise, it is just a very long list of facts about dead people. And what this story has changed for me at least is this. The understanding of what is real and what is invisible has never been as simple as it appears. Let me offer you one more historical detail, one that brings the entire story together in a way I find quietly devastating. There is a concept that historians of economics call GDP, gross domestic product, the measurement of everything a society produces in a year. Medieval societies had no such concept, but modern economists have tried retrospectively to estimate the economic output of medieval England. And almost universally in almost every historical accounting, the labour of medieval women in households, the brewing, the managing, the preserving, the textile production, the care of children, the organisation of food and resources is categorised as non-economic, as invisible, as things that happened but do not count. This is not a medieval problem. This is a very modern problem that we have projected backward onto history. The medieval household was an economic unit. The woman who ran it was doing economic work. The beer she brewed was traded. The cloth she produced was sold. The food she preserved sustained the labour force that built the cathedrals and fought the wars that the history books actually record. She was not outside the economy. She was the foundation of it. And we decided at some point that foundations don't count. I think about the medieval wife a lot more than I probably should, more than is easy to explain to people who ask what I've been reading lately. I think about her because she represents something that every era in human history has struggled with, the question of what we value and what we merely use. The medieval world valued piety, nobility, military prowess scholarship. It used the labour of women to keep all of those things functioning. It would not have survived a single winter without them, and it called that labour natural, which is the word every era uses when it wants to take something for granted without naming the price. But here is where I want to resist the purely dark reading. Because this story is not only about what was taken from medieval women, it is also about what they built with what they were given. The lying-in chamber, that room where no man could enter, where the midwife held absolute authority, where the knowledge passed from woman to woman for generations, that was not just a space of vulnerability. That was power. The keys, the stores, the household accounts that survive in archives and show women managing, negotiating, building. The Distaff Gospels, those 6 old women in Flanders gathering over winter evenings to record what they knew, is one of the most remarkable documents in medieval history. Not because it is glamorous, because it is honest. It is women deciding that their knowledge deserved to be preserved. The Paston Letters, that extraordinary collection of family correspondence, contains more letters written by or for the women of the family than by the men. Historians have noted this. In a world where women had no official voice, they found unofficial ones and used them. What does 1 year teach you? Historians who study life course patterns in medieval England, the way people move through stages of life in the medieval era, have noted something that I find genuinely moving. The transformation that happened to a woman in the first year of marriage was one of the most rapid and complete identity shifts that any medieval person experienced. More than any other transition in medieval life, more than the transition from apprentice to master, more than the transition from student to priest, the first year of marriage reshaped a woman's entire world, where she lived, who she answered to, what was expected of her body, what she was responsible for, what she knew, who she was. All of it changed in 12 months, without warning, without adequate preparation, without any guarantee of the outcome. And the remarkable thing is not that some women were destroyed by this. The remarkable thing is how many were not. How many arrived knowing nothing and left a year later knowing the stores and the servants and the keys and the roads between the market and the hearth, and the exact moment when the grain will run low and what to do when it does. There is one more thing I want to tell you. The church, which in this story has been a complicated presence, sometimes protective, sometimes constraining, always insisting that it had opinions about everything, did something in its marriage liturgy that I think is worth ending with. In the medieval wedding ceremony, after the vows, after the ring, after the dowry announced at the church door, the priest led the couple into the church, and there at the altar he spread his stole, the long cloth that symbolized his priestly authority over both of them. Both of them. Not over the husband alone, not over the bride to mark her transition, over both, and he prayed for them together, for their health, for their children, for their life together, in the most theologically significant language the medieval world possessed. Because for all its contradictions, for all the ways it constrained and limited and silenced women, the medieval church had also preserved at the centre of the sacrament of marriage this image: 2 people under the same cloth, the same protection, the same prayer, not equal in law, not equal in practice, but equal in the moment that mattered most to the people living it, the moment of asking God to keep them both alive. She made it through the year. I want to say that again because I think it deserves to be said simply. She made it through. The negotiations and the wedding and the feast, the strange house and the keys and the mother-in-law's watching eyes, the church's calendar of forbidden days, the quickening and the room and the 40 days of stillness, the churching in her white veil. She made it through a year that most modern people would find genuinely overwhelming, even with all the advantages we carry. She made it through without anesthesia, without antibiotics, without a legal identity, without the right to choose most of what happened to her. And at the end of it, she was still there, holding the keys, running the household, caring for the child she had almost died to bring into the world, remembering maybe in some small private moment the girl she had been before all of this, and wondering perhaps what that girl would think of who she'd become. I think she would be astonished. I think about her when I look at the things that get called ordinary, the meals that appear and are eaten and disappear, the houses that are kept warm, the children who are kept alive, the knowledge passed between women in kitchens and hospitals and offices, and quietly in every era, in every corner of the world, knowledge that does not appear in history books, because history books have always found it easier to record the people who made wars than the people who kept everything running while they did. The medieval wife is not an artifact. She is a mirror, and what she reflects back is the question every society has to answer about what it actually values versus what it merely claims to value. We have spent this night together inside a year that ended 700 years ago. We've walked through negotiations and ceremonies and rules that sound alien to modern ears. We have met women who are legally invisible and practically indispensable. We have seen the gap, that constant, irreducible gap between what the medieval world said about women and what medieval women actually did. We have found in the letters and the court records and the household accounts evidence of love that was not supposed to exist, power that was not supposed to be exercised, knowledge that was not supposed to be valued. And in all of it, underneath all of it, we have found this human beings finding ways to live with dignity in a world that did not always make that easy, which is, I suppose, the only story history has ever really told. I want to thank you, not in a small, polite way, in the way that actually means something. You stayed with this story through 12 parts and hundreds of years, and one extraordinary ordinary year in medieval England. You listened to the paperwork and the prayers and the sealed windows. You listened to the keys and the alewives and the letters, and the woman who called someone my own sweetheart 7 years in. You did what readers and listeners have always done. When history is done well, you let the past be real, not a backdrop, not a warning, not a quaint curiosity, real. With people in it who felt what we feel, who feared what we fear, who loved imperfectly and persistently the way we love. If something in tonight's story moved you or surprised you or made you want to know more, please leave it in the comments. I read every one, and if you have a woman in your life who does the work that does not get counted, who holds the household together, who carries the invisible load, who knows where everything is, and who needs what and when, you might want to tell her. Not tomorrow, now. Because the medieval wife had no Oliver leader writing regret into his will, to remind us that the acknowledgement comes too late. We have the advantage of knowing the lesson in advance. The story of 1 year ends here, but the stories do not. I am already sitting with the next one, another woman, another world, another year that changed everything, and I cannot wait to bring it to you. Until then, sleep well, dream of something ancient and alive, and know that somewhere 700 years ago, a woman woke up before dawn in a house that was finally hers, looked at the keys hanging by the door and went to work, just like always, just like every day before it, just like the day that was about to begin.